We have the pleasure today to be joined by Professor Niall Ferguson. Thank you for joining the Harvard Kennedy School Student Policy Review, Professor Ferguson.
Great to be with you.
So, the US and China share the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. You have named this interconnection between them Chimerica. Is there room for cooperation between the two nations today?
I think there is, but I don't think we should regard it as an alternative to their complex strategic competition. It's going on simultaneously. I used the word Chimerica for the first time way back in 2007. And when Moritz Schullerich and I came up with that word, it was designed to be a pun on a word that you'll know, chimera. And the idea was that this was an unsustainable combination in which the two economies had almost fused since China's admission to the World Trade Organization. And that fusion was very, very asymmetrical because China did the exporting and America did the importing, and China did the saving and America did the consuming, and so on. And our expectation was that Chimerica would not last and that it was bound, in fact, to die. The surprising thing was that, in fact, it didn't. It went through a crisis. We were right that it was going to cause a crisis, and the global financial crisis had partly its roots in Chimerica. But Chimerica didn't die. And in fact, it still exists. If you look at the scale of the trade flows, the size of China's trade surplus with the US is still enormous. The bilateral deficit, if you look at the American data, is about a quarter of the total US trade deficit, down from a peak of a third, but far from gone. So what's really fascinating about Cold War II, which is what I think we're in, is that it coexists with Chimerica. You have a Cold War going on between two superpowers, but they're also trading with one another on a large scale, which of course was not the case in Cold War I.
So we have a very interesting coexistence between the two. On a side note, how about America's fiscal path?
Well, it's been unsustainable for so long that you begin to wonder if it's actually sustainable. I think I first wrote about this in a book called Colossus. That's more than 20 years ago. And I pointed out that there was a structural imbalance in public finances. Tax base was insufficient. The expenditures were programmed to keep rising because of the entitlement system and the aging population and so on. And here we are. Now, the debt has only got bigger. It surged in the wake of the financial crisis, and it surged again in the wake of the pandemic. It's a bipartisan project because it surged under Trump and it surged under Biden. And it has exceeded 100% of GDP. It's up there where it was relative to GDP after World War II. And if you look at the Congressional Budget Office's latest projections out to mid-century, there isn't a single scenario that they imagine in which it comes down. And indeed, in some of the scenarios, it explodes. These are scenarios where the growth rate is relatively low or the interest rates stay relatively elevated. And if you have that nasty fiscal arithmetic of positive real rates, it's amazing how quickly a debt can grow. So it is unsustainable, something at some point we'll have to give. Ferguson's law states that when a great power is spending more on debt service than on defense, it's in trouble. I think the US is pretty much at that point. So I think if one looks ahead another 20 years, it's inconceivable in my mind that there won't be profound consequences. And at some point, the political system will have to reckon with these consequences because the cost of servicing such a large debt will impact other priorities of the federal government.
Sounds fair. Let's switch back to U.S.-China competition. Do you think that the superpower showdown over Taiwan is possible in the near future?
It's certainly possible. It's even likely, I think, in a time frame of, let's say, the next 5 years. Why do I think that? Well, both sides have talked tougher in recent years than in the past. The difference is that now China has established significant military capabilities that it didn't have at the time of the last Taiwan Strait crisis in the mid-1990s. It has missiles that could sink US aircraft carriers. And so you have the combination of tough talk, though it became a little less tough in November at the time of the San Francisco summit. It's back to being tough if you listen to what the Chinese say. And you've got military balance. That means that the US doesn't really have deterrence. It doesn't really credibly have the capability to deter China from, say, blockading Taiwan. And China doesn't really have sufficient dominance to convince a US president that it wouldn't be worth running the blockade. So you create the perfect combination of elements for a crisis. Each side thinks that the timing's quite good and could get worse. And you have, of course, the fundamental reality that Taiwan is growing away from the People's Republic of China. That wasn't supposed to happen. The expectation back 50 years ago was that over time, it was kind of unlikely that they would remain completely separate. But the prospect of organic, quote unquote, reunification has faded. The Taiwanese have developed their own distinct democratic political culture and identity. So this isn't going to happen naturally and peacefully. If it's going to happen at all, it's going to require coercion by Beijing. And I don't know whether it's this year, next year, the year after that, or 2027, which was the year Bill Burns said recently China was aiming to be ready to be able to invade Taiwan. But I'm pretty sure a showdown is coming, yes.
President Xi says that the East is irresistibly rising, while the West inevitably declining. You said regarding US and China competition that when you're in a Cold War, play for time. Whose side is time on?
It's a great quotation, borrowed actually from Mao Zedong. There's no denying that relative to Mao's time, the East has risen and risen spectacularly. And I hardly need to recap the fact that China, after Mao, beginning with Deng Xiaoping, had the biggest and fastest industrial revolution of them all. And this has catapulted China into a situation when in around 2016, it overtook the US in terms of gross domestic product, measured on the basis of purchasing power parity. Measured on the current dollar basis that I think is more relevant, especially if you're talking about who's buying semiconductors and who's buying oil, China has plateaued some 20% or so behind the US. And that means that it is no longer so clear that China, or rather the East, is rising and the West declining. Actually, not only has China stalled, but the US has surged. Back when I was writing the book Doom during the pandemic in 2020, I bet against the grain of conventional wisdom and said, actually, the US will come out of this stronger and China weaker. And that was correct in a whole lot of ways. I'm pleased with those final parts of the book Doom because they called subsequent events quite correctly. And now there is real doubt, not only in the minds of investors around the world, but in the minds of Chinese leaders as to whether they really can make it. So I think the scenario looks a lot different from it did when I was writing a book called Civilization, The West and the Rest, which concluded that really the great divergence was over and we were living through the great reconvergence. The great reconvergence has slowed down and it could very well stop altogether if, and this is the big if, China's growth rate continues to decline, which I think it will. I don't think China will ever catch up with the US in current dollar terms, because I think it's running into such strong headwinds from its demographics, from debt dynamics, and from US policy of tariffs and technological sanctions. It's just not going to make it. And that means that everything looks different. We no longer can assume that Xi Jinping confidently expects China to keep on rising. His problem is that might no longer be true.
So you had said that they are not the masters, but that clearly are not the apprentices anymore. This still holds, right?
Oh, that's clear. The remarkable thing about China's economic development since China joined the World Trade Organization back in 2001 is how very rapidly they ascended the value chain. I mean, it's not that long ago that China was exporting apparel and shoes and that kind of stuff. Then it got up the value chain to machine tools and machinery. And now it's effectively the only competitor the United States has in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. That's a phenomenal ascent of the technological complexity ladder. But it's not quite there. It hasn't achieved parity with the United States, not in aggregate terms and also not in technological terms. So I think the interesting moment has arrived when we see if there's some kind of gap that China can't close. Now, notice, it's not a gap with the United States when it comes to semiconductors, it's a gap with Taiwan. And the amazing thing is that China just can't seem to make its own TSMC. It cannot make the most sophisticated semiconductors. And it certainly can't make them when it's on the receiving end of US sanctions that cut it off from key technology to make those semiconductors. So in that sense, it's sort of number 2 ranked master. The United States is firmly still number 1 master if you include those parts of the global economy that are closely aligned with the United States, including the Netherlands as well as Taiwan.
And how do the third world power, Russia, and the rising power, India, enter the equation?
Well, as I said earlier, I think we're in Cold War II. There are 2 superpowers, and although they're engaged in a kind of economic symbiosis, there is a de-risking, if not decoupling, going on. And they compete, as in the first Cold War, in a whole bunch of different domains: technological, space, just in building armaments, including nuclear weapons. They compete geopolitically for certain regions. They compete ideologically. It's as close to being Cold War II as I think you could get. Of course, it doesn't need to be the same any more than World War II was the same as World War I, but it needs to be samey enough for the numerical 2 to be applicable. In this Cold War, as in the first Cold War, there are other players. They're just not superpowers. And the other players have 3 options, really. One is aligned with the US. The other is aligned with the communist superpower. And the third is be non-aligned. And that's really how we can answer your question. Russia is aligned with China closely. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin probably meet more frequently than any other 2 world leaders. India is in practice non-aligned. Of course, we would like to think that India was aligned with the United States, thanks to the Quad. But if you talk to Indian ministers, and I heard one at the Munich Security Conference just about a week ago, they're quite proud of the fact that they're having it both ways, that they can get Prime Minister Narendra Modi feted in Washington, but also have him show up at the BRICS meeting and hang out with the leaders of the other BRICS countries, including, of course, China. So I think that's how to think about this. It's not quite the same as Cold War I. In Cold War I, India was very deliberately non-aligned, but lent towards the Soviets. And that was something that drove presidents such as Richard Nixon nuts. Now it's non-aligned, but kind of leaning towards the United States. Because, of course, India and China have a border dispute and many other reasons to be at odds with one another. So I don't think the tendency will be the same. I think the tendency will be for India to lean towards the United States, but not to be an ally that it can really depend on.
That's fair. So let's switch back to the 2 superpowers. What strengths and weaknesses have the US and China each inherited from their respective histories, so institutions and cultural traits?
Well, from an applied historian, there are some questions that are almost too big to handle, especially on a Zoom call, but let me try. The United States has inherited the ultimate political operating system. The US Constitution and the rule of law that's embedded in it and disseminated through its system. Its system remains decentralized because it's a federal system. And so there's meaningful competition between, say, Florida and California. And what this means is that the United States is extraordinarily attractive to entrepreneurial people from all over the world, as well as to capital from all over the world, because there's really no better place in the world to start and build a business than the United States of America. So that's the most obvious legacy of America's past, and its habit established over nearly a quarter of the millennium of attracting people from the rest of the world and turning them into Americans, which it's really good at. And this is, I think, perhaps the superpower of the superpower. China's tradition comes in really two different forms. The tradition of the imperial system, the multiple imperial dynasties, and then the Maoist tradition that began with the 1949 revolution. And Xi Jinping represents an emperor, but a red emperor, who synthesizes elements of the long-run history of China and elements of its relatively recent past as a people's republic. There are strengths to that system. It's capable of mobilizing a vast population. Its ability hinges on the vast numbers of Chinese people who are members of the CCP, of the Chinese Communist Party, and can therefore do the bidding of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, whatever that happens to be, including locking everybody up in their apartments at the height of a pandemic. I mean, the power of mobilization is, I think, second to none in the world. So those are the strengths. When the CCP decided to do crazy things, like the Great Leap Forward, it could mobilize people to do crazy things that led to famine and indeed mass starvation and even cannibalism. When the CCP decides we're going to do the market economy, it can be equally effective but positive in its results. And so there's no way you can imagine China's incredible industrial revolution after 1979 without the CCP directing resources in the way that it did and encouraging entrepreneurship in the way that it had previously discouraged it. And so that really is China's greatest strength, its ability to mobilize its people to do extraordinary things, both bad and good. What's the great American weakness? The great American weakness is our focus on business and consumption transcends our ability to think strategically, and our bipartisan two-party system of politics combined with the internet has led to a really toxic polarization in political life. What are China's weaknesses? There is too much power in the hands, really, of one man and the people immediately around him. And as his decision-making has erred, so China's miracle has begun to fade. And that's why I think Cold War II is so interesting, because each of the superpowers has undeniable strengths, but each has weaknesses. And if it comes to a collision, it's quite hard to say which will in fact be in a better position. I'll just make one final observation. One thing we've learned from the war in Ukraine is that in conventional warfare, stuff matters, and the ability to mass produce stuff, whether it's 155mm shells or drones, really matters. Here, China is unquestionably stronger than the United States, which has allowed its military-industrial complex to wither away. And so one obvious takeaway from history is that if you are 2x the size of your rival in terms of manufacturing capacity, then you are going to have an advantage in a conventional war, unless that war is over really quickly.
And finally, Neil, there is this notion that all civilizations, no matter how magnificent, are condemned to decline and fall. America was founded at the 18th century, that blossomed in the 19th. The 20th was America's. What about the 21st?
Well, I can show you a whole bunch of books that predicted not so long ago that it would be the Asian century or the Chinese century. China would rule the world. I remember my friend Martin Jakes published a book, When China Rules the World. I don't think that is what the 21st century is going to witness unless the United States makes a series of really huge strategic blunders. And here I challenge the premise of your question. I don't think history is telling us that there's a cycle of empire or a cycle of great power. In fact, history is quite non-rhythmic when you look at it. And it's non-rhythmic because it's punctuated by so many disasters, some natural and some man-made, from pandemics to wars, that it'd be very hard to have a real cycle of history. Moreover, if you look at the duration of empires, it varies massively. Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire covers 1,000 years. What would I give to live in an empire that took 1,000 years to decline and fall? We don't really have a good handle on the periodicity of empire. The empire that Hitler built was really barely a decade in duration. In fact, less if you think that it really didn't begin until 1936 and was dead by 1945. So I think we should stop thinking about rising and falling powers following some kind of predictable cycle, almost like the seasons, because I don't think that's what the historical process is like. I think the historical process is characterized by lots of non-linearity, as well as by agency. So put it this way, bad decision-making by the President of the United States could lead the US into a conflict with China over Taiwan that it could lose. The United States would quite possibly lose such a conflict. Why would it lose it? Because it would run out of precision missiles in a week, because the public would be divided as it's divided on all issues, and would quite quickly begin to argue that it wasn't worth sending American boys to die for Taipei. And so there's a way in which the US blows this catastrophically. Equally, there's a way in which good decision-making, what I would call détente 2.0, allows the US to buy the time that will ultimately expose China's vulnerabilities, which are disastrous demographically. The population of China will likely halve between now and the end of the century. If the US reformed immigration in a rational way, it could do the exact opposite and have a substantial surge. So it's in our hands. The great lesson of history for me is that we're not the prisoners of vast deterministic forces at all. No cycles of empire are discernible. We are, in fact, in command of our own destinies. And as a free society, we really ought to always get the better of the unfree societies, because the unfree societies can never be as creative as us, because there's not enough accountability and power is in too few hands.
Niall Ferguson, thank you very much for this very productive conversation.
Thanks, Nikolas.